What Herodotus the Halicarnassian has learned by inquiry is here set forth, in order that so the memory of the past may not be blotted out from among men by time, and that great and marvelous deeds done by Greeks and foreigners, and especially the reason why they warred against each other, may not lack renown. So this is Herodotus's introduction to his work called the History. The Greek word historia means literally inquiry. It's an investigation into cause and effect. So he's setting out to meet all these people, gather all these stories, and recount all these things which were done in the past so that the memory of them would not pass away from men, and that people would know about the great and marvelous deeds done by not only Greeks, but also foreigners as well. And that's his inquiry. That's what this work is about. But it has a particular purpose, which is to illuminate the reason for the conflict between Greece and Asia, and in particular Persia, which was happening in Herodotus' time. So he wants to set the context and background for that. The Persian learned men say that the Phoenicians were the cause of the feud. These, they say, came to our seas from the sea which is called Red, and having settled in the country which they still occupy, at once began to make long voyages. Among other places to which they carried Egyptian and Assyrian merchandise, they came to Argos, which was about that time preeminent in every way among the people of what is now called Hellas. The Phoenicians then came, as I say, to Argos, and set out their cargo. On the 5th or 6th day from their coming, their wares being now well nigh all sold, there came to the seashore, among many other women, the king's daughter, whose name, according to Persians and Greeks alike, was Io, the daughter of Inachus. They stood about the stern of the ship, and while they bargained for such wares as they fancied, the Phoenicians hearkened to each other to the deed, and rushed to take them. Most of the women escaped. Io with others was carried off. The men cast her into the ship and made sail away for Egypt. All right, so Herodotus is giving us the first beginning cause of this ongoing conflict between the Greeks and the Asians, and he points to the Phoenicians as the cause of the feud, the initial cause of the feud, according to the Persian account. Now, if you're not familiar with Phoenicians, these were a Semitic seafaring people from the Mediterranean coast of Canaan, the area which is modern-day Lebanon, southern Syria, and northern Israel. The Phoenicians were a culture of seafarers. They were traders and explorers, shipbuilders. They founded numerous colonies all over the Mediterranean in places like Spain. They had a famous colony there called Tarshish, which is mentioned in the Bible. As well as North Africa, they founded the city of Carthage, which would later become the great rival to the Romans. That's in the country that is modern-day Tunisia. They claim their land of origin is around the Erythraean Sea. So in this translation of Herodotus, he calls it the Red Sea. The actual Greek name for it is the Erythraean Sea, which is not the Red Sea proper as it is on our maps in Egypt. It's actually farther south and east over near the area of the Persian Gulf where Bahrain is. It's where the Phoenicians placed their point of origin before settling in the land of Canaan. And the Phoenicians would have been basically indistinguishable from native Canaanites, just one tribe of them, essentially. And they would have been related to people like the Philistines in the Bible. So these Phoenicians came and abducted Io from Argos. Now, Argos is one of the main city-states in Greece. It's on the southern part of the Greek peninsula, right north of Sparta. And Io was princess, the daughter of Inachus. So they captured her and took her away with them, and she eventually ended up in Egypt. This, say the Persians, but not the Greeks, was how Io came to Egypt, and this, according to them, was the first wrong that was done. Next, according to their tale, certain Greeks, they cannot tell who, landed at Tyre in Phoenicia, and carried off the king's daughter, Europa. These Greeks must, I suppose, have been Cretans. So far, then, the account between them stood balanced. But after this, say they, it was the Greeks who were guilty of the second wrong. They sailed in a long ship to Aea of the Colchians and the river Phasis. And when they had done the rest of the business for which they came, they carried off the king's daughter Medea. When the Colchian king sent a herald to demand reparation for the robbery and restitution of his daughter, the Greeks replied that as they had been refused reparation for the abduction of the Argive Io, neither would they make any to the Colchians. So after the abduction of Io, the Greeks, which he supposes must have been Cretans, abduct Europa. Now, the reason he assumes they're probably Cretans is because in these ancient semi-mythological times, the only Greeks who were major seafarers at that point was Cretans. They were from the island of Crete. They were the primary sea power at the time. So they abduct Europa, the Phoenician princess, who is said to be the daughter of the king Agenor of Tyre. So like Io, Europa is also a character in myth who is abducted by Zeus, who transported her to the island of Crete, where she would become the mother of the legendary King Minos. And she's also mentioned in that vein in Homer's Iliad. So Herodotus is here presenting a little bit different story about how Europa came to be abducted and how she came to wind up in Crete. And he's mentioning that these guys sailed in a long ship to Aea and the river Phasis, and when they had done the rest of the business for which they came, they carried off the king's daughter, Medea. What he's referring to here is the expedition of Jason and the Argonauts. That's the business for which they came. So the Asians and the Greeks were even because the Greeks lost Io, the Asians lost Europa, they were even, but then the Greeks tipped the balance again by abducting Medea. Then, so the story runs, in the second generation after this, Alexandrus, son of Priam, having heard this tale, was minded to win himself a wife out of Hellas by ravishment, for he was well persuaded that, as the Greeks had made no reparation, so neither would he. So he carried off Helen. The Greeks first resolved to send messengers demanding that Helen should be restored, and atonement made for the rape. But when this proposal was made, the Trojans pleaded the rape of Medea, and reminded the Greeks that they had asked reparation of others, yet had made none themselves, nor given up the plunder at request. So once again, Herodotus is giving an interesting take on ancient Greek history. Alexandrus, the son of Priam, is also known by the name Paris. He is the one who abducted Helen of Sparta and took her to Troy, and that's what kicked off the famous Trojan War. So Herodotus is here assigning him the motivation of basically getting even with the Greeks. He was persuaded that since the Greeks never made reparation, he wouldn't either. Thus far, it was a matter of mere robbery on both sides. But after this, the Persians say, the Greeks were greatly to blame, for they invaded Asia before the Persians attacked Europe. We think, say they, that it is wrong to carry women off, but to be zealous to avenge the rape is foolish. Wise men take no account of such things, for plainly the women would never have been carried away, had not they themselves wished it. We of Asia regarded the rape of our women not at all, but the Greeks, all for the sake of a Lacedaemonian woman, mustered a great host, came to Asia, and destroyed the power of Priam. Ever since then we have regarded Greeks as our enemies. The Persians claim Asia for their own, and the foreign nations that dwell in it. Europe and the Greek race they hold to be separate from them. So the Persian perspective, probably trying to downplay the significance of the times when they were abducting women from the Greeks, they say, listen, it's not that big a deal. You know, the women probably would not have been carried off if they didn't want to go, so we don't consider, we ask for reparation, but we're not going to go to war over it. It's not such a big deal. The Greeks, on the other hand, you guys launched an entire war and destroyed one of the great nations of Asia, all because, they carried off a Spartan woman. So it refers to her as Helen as a Lacedaemonian woman. Lacedaemonia is another name for Sparta, the southernmost city-state in the Greek peninsula. Another name for that land is Laconia. And so the name Lacedaemonia is actually composed from Laconia, which is the name of the region, and the Greek word daemon, which means spirit. So it literally means the spirit of Laconia, Lacedaemonia. And it also references a semi-legendary king, one of the early kings of Sparta, of the same name. Such is the Persian account of the matter. In their opinion, it was the taking of Troy which began their feud with the Greeks. But the Phoenicians do not tell the same story about Io as the Persians. They say that they did not carry her off to Egypt by force. She had intercourse in Argos with the captain of the ship. Then, perceiving herself to be with child, she was ashamed that her parents should know it, and so, lest they should discover her condition, she sailed away with the Phoenicians of her own accord. So, we might have our suspicions about the sincerity of the Phoenician perspective of that particular abduction. But in any case, they are supporting the Persian perspective that, listen, Io wanted to go. She made a mistake, and it wasn't an abduction. These are the stories of the Persians and the Phoenicians. For my own part, I will not say this or that story is true, but I will name him whom I myself know to have done unprovoked wrong to the Greeks, and so go forward with my history, and speak of small and great cities alike. For many states that were once great have now become small, and those that were great in my time were small formerly. Knowing therefore that human prosperity never continues in one stay, I will make mention alike of both kinds. So, this is a rather characteristic take of Herodotus. He is committed to giving all the stories. He gives the Persian story, the Phoenician story, the Greek story, and he doesn't necessarily pass judgment on it. He's not going to pick one which is the right one. He's just simply going to present all the perspectives. But he is going to talk about one who did wrong to the Greeks. Croesus was by birth a Lydian, son of Alyattes, and monarch of all the nations west of the river Halys, which flows from the south between Syria and Paphlagonia, and issues northward into the sea called Euxinus. This Croesus was, as far as we know, the first foreigner who subdued Greeks and took tribute of them, and won the friendship of others, the former being the Ionians, the Aeolians, and the Dorians of Asia, and the latter the Lacedaemonians. Before the reign of Croesus, all Greeks were free, for the Sumerian hosts which invaded Ionia before this time did not subdue the cities, but rather raided and robbed them. So now he's transitioning to the Lydian king Croesus, and he was born around the year 595 BC, and he was defeated by the Persian king Cyrus the Great around the year 546. He's notable because, as far as we know, he was one of the first, possibly the first, ruler to mint gold coins. And because of the gold-wealthy rivers in his region and his use of gold coins to pay his troops, he was reputed among the Greeks to be fantastically wealthy. But this guy, Herodotus points out, was the first foreigner who was able to subdue Greeks and take tribute of them, while simultaneously being allied with others. So the Greeks that he subdued were the Ionians, the Aeolians, and the Dorians. These are basically three different dialectic tribes of Greeks who lived in Asia Minor on the coast of Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. As with the designation Hellenes, or Greeks, remember at this time Greece was not a country, so when they're speaking about the Greeks, they're speaking about essentially people of a loose common ethnic origin who all speak the same language. But they're going to be in different tribal groups, they're going to belong to different city-states, they're frequently going to be enemies. So in this case, the Ionians, the Aeolians, and the Dorians were all Greek-speaking people who lived and intermarried in Asia Minor, but they each had a slightly different Greek dialect. Now the sovereign power, which belonged to the descendants of Heracles, fell to the family of Croesus, the Myrminidae as they were called, in the following way. Candaules, whom the Greeks call Myrsilus, was the ruler of Sardis. He was descended from Alcaeus, son of Heracles. Agron, son of Ninus, son of Belus, son of Alcaeus, was the first Heraclid king of Sardis, and Candaules, son of Myrsis, was the last. The kings of this country before Agron were descendants of Lydius, son of Atys, from whom all this Lydian district took its name. Before that it was called the land of the Maii. From these the Heraclidae, descendants of Heracles and a female slave of Iardanus, received the sovereignty and held it in charge by reason of an oracle, and they ruled for 22 generations, 505 years, son succeeding father, down to Candaules, son of Myrsis. So Herodotus is here giving the context for this king Candaules. The sovereign power belonged to the descendants of Heracles, and this was true in most Greek-speaking and Greek-speaking adjacent countries that were around there. The royal lines traced their lineage and therefore their divine authority to the legendary hero Heracles. And the family of Croesus, he was not a Heraclidian ruler or a descendant of Heracles. He was of the Myrmidai dynasty, and he's about to tell the story of how that came to pass. So he's giving here the lineage of Candaules, who was the king of the line of Heracles, and describing how he received the royal authority. But now he's going to tell the story of how that royal dynasty passed away from Candaules and eventually came down to the family of Croesus.
This Candaules, then, fell in love with his own wife, so much that he supposed her to be by far the fairest woman in the world, and being persuaded of this, he raved of her beauty to Gyges, son of Aeschylus, who was his favorite among his bodyguard, for it was to Gyges that he entrusted all his weightiest secrets. Then after a little while Candaules, being doomed to ill fortune, spoke thus to Gyges: I think, Gyges, that you do not believe what I tell you of the beauty of my wife. Men trust their ears less than their eyes. Do you, then, so contrive that you may see her naked? Gyges exclaimed loudly at this. Master, said he, what a pestilent command is this that you lay upon me, that I should see her who is my mistress naked? With the stripping off of her tunic a woman is stripped of the honor due to her. Men have long ago made wise rules for our learning. One of these is that we, and none other, should see what is our own. As for me, I fully believe that your queen is the fairest of all women. Ask not lawless acts of me, I entreat you. So Herodotus is here presenting us the tale of how the line of the Heraclidae ended and passed to the Myrmidons. So Gyges was the founder of the Myrmidon dynasty. He ruled from around 687 to 652 BC. He campaigned against the Sumerians, and he comes up in Plato. Plato has a very interesting story about him, which kind of forms a motif that works its way into Tolkien in our own times. Plato mentions that Gyges found a magical ring that granted the wearer invisibility. So here Herodotus is presenting the story of the rise of Gyges and the fall of Candaules through Candaules' own folly. And he says he's doomed to ill fortune, but this is obviously ill fortune brought on by his lack of wisdom and prudence. Thus speaking, Gyges sought to turn the king's purpose, for he feared lest some ill to himself should come of it. But this was Candaules' answer: Take courage, Gyges. Fear not that I say this to put you to the proof, nor that my wife will do you any harm. I will so contrive the whole business that she will never know that you have seen her. I will bring you into the chamber where she and I lie, and set you behind the open door, and after I have entered, my wife too will come to her bed. There is a chair set near the entrance of the room. On this she will lay each part of her raiment as she takes it off, and you will be able to gaze upon her at your leisure. Then, when she goes from the chair to the bed, turning her back upon you, do you look to it that she does not see you going out through the doorway. As Gyges could not escape, he consented. Candaules, when he judged it to be bedtime, brought Gyges into the chamber. His wife presently followed, and when she had come in and was laying aside her garments, Gyges beheld her. And when she turned her back upon him, going to her bed, he slipped privily from the room. The woman saw him as he passed out, and perceived what her husband had done. But shamed though she was, she never cried out, nor let it be seen that she had perceived aught. For she had it in mind to punish Candaules, seeing that among the Lydians and most of the foreign peoples it is held great shame that even a man should be seen naked. So Herodotus makes this point about the great shame of being seen naked, because this was not the case among the Greeks. The Greeks frequently went to baths and gymnasiums, and in these places they were naked. They trained naked, and in places like Sparta, even the women and girls would train naked. So it was not unusual for the Greeks to see tons of naked Greeks, but among the other tribes that was considered shameful and dishonorable. For the nonce she made no sign and held her peace, But as soon as it was day, she assured herself of those of her household whom she perceived to be most faithful to her, and called Gyges, who, supposing that she knew nothing of what had been done, came at call, for he had always been wont to attend the queen whenever she bade him. So, when he came, the lady thus addressed him: Now, Gyges, you have two roads before you. Choose which you will follow. You must either kill Candales and take me for your own, and the throne of Lydia, or yourself be killed now without more ado. That will prevent you from obeying all Candales' commands in the future and seeing what you should not see. One of you must die, either he, the contriver of this plot, or you, who have outraged all usage by looking on me unclad. At this, Gyges stood a while astonished. Presently he entreated her not to compel him to such a choice. But when he could not move her, and saw that dire necessity was in very truth upon him either to kill his master or himself be killed by others, he chose his own life. Then he asked the queen to tell him, since she forced him against his will to slay his master, how they were to attack the king, and she replied, You shall come at him from the same place whence you made to see me naked. Attack him in his sleep. So when they had made ready this plot, and night had fallen, Gyges followed the lady into the chamber, for he could not get free or by any means escape, but either he or Candales must die. And she gave him a dagger, and hid him behind the same door, and presently he stole out and slew Candales as he slept, and thus made himself master of the king's wife and sovereignty. He is mentioned in the iambic verses of Archilochus of Parus, who lived about the same time. An iambic verse is a type of Greek poetry. An iambic refers to a metrical foot when a word is broken down into two syllables, a short syllable followed by a long stressed syllable. That's an iamb, and a verse composed of those iambs is an iambic verse. So an example of an iambic trimeter would be something like, We romped until the pans. That's a trimeter because it's got three of those iambic feet. We romped until the pans. And something like an iambic pentameter consists of 5 iambic feet in a line of poetry. So consider a line from Alfred Tennyson's Ulysses: To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. That's 5 iambic feet. So he took possession of the sovereign power and was confirmed therein by the Delphic oracle. For when the Lydians were much angered by the fate of Candales and took up arms, the faction of Gyges and the rest of the people came to an agreement that if the oracle should ordain him to be king of the Lydians, then he should reign, but if not, then he should render back the kingship to the Heraclidae. The oracle did so ordain, and Gyges thus became king. Howbeit the Pythian priestess declared that the Heraclidae should have vengeance on Gyges' posterity in the 5th generation, an utterance of which the Lydians and their kings took no account till it was fulfilled. So this replacing of Candales by Gyges and the ending of the Heraclidean line was a bit of a big deal. It wasn't quite a civil war, but many people in the country were not happy about the royal line of Heracles ending in this way, with a servant killing the king, which obviously could be viewed as a very treacherous thing if you didn't know the details of this story. So in a very wise manner of resolving this conflict, they put it to the Delphic oracle. Now, the Oracle of Delphi was the most sacred oracle of Greece. It was located in the center of the Greek peninsula at Delphi, a place which the ancient Greeks believed was the center or navel of the world. There was a stone there called the Umphalos Stone, and Umphalos means the navel. So that was a very, very sacred place. And the oracle was somebody who essentially received messages from the gods and transmitted them to people. So people would come to the oracle to put questions to them, and the oracle would give them the divine answer. And typically the oracle would give them a very cryptic answer, like a riddle. And oftentimes the reality of their answer would not even be seen until after all these things came to pass, much the same way prophecy is often unclear until it is fulfilled, and then it's seen in retrospect very clearly. So the temple at Delphi was sacred to Apollo, and that's why it's named Pythian. She's called the Pythian priestess, because in legend, that's the place, Delphi is the place where the god Apollo slew the mighty serpent Python, which was a sort of prototypical dragon or giant serpent. And they say that the fumes of the decaying corpse under the earth would rise through the cracks in the earth in the temple floor. And it was the fumes. Now, there are fumes from the earth that do come up into the temple. According to the Greek legends, those were fumes of the decaying corpse of Python. But a lot of scholars think that it's possibly the inhaling of these fumes wafting up from under the earth into the temple, which would induce the kind of hallucinogenic trance of the priestess who would give the oracles of the gods. Thus did the Myrmidai rob the Heraclidae of the sovereignty, and take it for themselves. Having gained it, Gyges sent not a few offerings to Delphi. There are very many silver offerings of his there, and besides the silver he dedicated great store of gold, among which 6 golden bowls are the offerings chiefly worthy of record. These weigh 30 talents, and stand in the treasury of the Corinthians, though in very truth it is the treasury not of the Corinthian people, but of Caepsilus, son of Aetion. This Gyges then was the first foreigner of our knowledge who placed offerings at Delphi after the king of Phrygia, Midas, son of Gordias. For Midas too made an offering, to wit, the royal seat whereon he sat to give judgment, and a marvelous seat it is. It is set in the same place as the bowls of Gyges. This gold and the silver offered by Gyges is called by the Delphians Gygian, after its dedicator. So, a quick catalog of the treasures that Gyges heaped on the oracle, the temple at Delphi, understandably, because thanks to the oracle, he became the king and established a new dynasty. And it was common practice, especially if you were king, if you wanted to gain insight from the oracle, it was common practice to bring an offering. And at the temple at Delphi, there were different treasuries for different city-states and countries, and the offerings would go in those treasuries. So he's given a great deal of silver and 6 golden bowls that weigh 30 talents. Now, a talent is a measure of metal weight, and the Attic measurement from Greece is equal to 58 pounds. So these are immense, heavy golden bowls. A talent of gold in our times would be worth approximately $6 million. That's 1 talent. As soon as Gyges came to the throne, he, too, like others, led an army into the lands of Miletus and Smyrna, and he took the city of Colophon. But he did nothing else great in his reign of 38 years. I will therefore say no more of him, and will speak rather of Ardes, the son of Gyges, who succeeded him. He took Priene and invaded the country of Miletus, and it was while he was monarch of Sardis that the Sumerians, driven from their lands by the nomad Scythians, came into Asia, and took Sardis, all but the citadel. So the Sumerians, or Cimmerians, were a nomadic race of Indo-European horse warriors from the Pontic steppe. And at this time, approximately, they were displaced by the Scythians. Anthropologically, it's a little bit hard to tell the difference between them and the Scythians. They have very, very similar cultures, so archaeologically, there's not really a clear distinction, but these were 2 different people groups. And if you're familiar with Conan the Barbarian of 80s action movie fame, he was supposed to be a Cimmerian. Ardes reigned for 49 years and was succeeded by his son Sadyates, who reigned for 12 years. And after Sadyates came Alyattes, who waged war against Deioces' descendant Cyaxares and the Medes, and drove the Sumerians out of Asia, took Smyrna, which was a colony from Colophon, and invaded the lands of Clazomenae. But here he came off not at all as he wished, but with great disaster. Of other deeds done by him in his reign, these were the most notable. As he's listing all these different place names, these are all areas in Asia Minor, Anatolia, so just refer back to the map that shows all these various regions and city-states and such. He continued the war against the Milesians, which his father had begun. This was the manner in which he attacked and laid siege to Miletus. He sent his invading army, marching to the sound of pipes and harps and flutes, bass and treble, when the crops in the land were ripe. And whenever he came to the Milesian territory, the country dwellings he neither demolished, nor burnt, nor tore off their doors, but let them stand unharmed. But the trees and the crops of the land he destroyed, and so returned whence he came. For as the Milesians had command of the sea, it was of no avail for his army to besiege their city. The reason why the Lydian did not destroy the houses was this, that the Milesians might have homes whence to plant and cultivate their land, and that there might be the fruit of their toil for his invading army to lay waste. So keep in mind that this time, when armies were on campaign, they typically didn't have giant supply trains all the way back to their home country. They would forage and live off the land of the place they were invading. In this manner he waged war for 11 years, and in these years 2 great disasters befell the Milesians, one at the battle of Lemenion in their own territory, and the other in the valley of the Meander. For 6 of these 11 years Sadiates, son of Ardes, was still ruler of Lydia, and he it was who invaded the lands of Miletus, for it was he who had begun the war. For the following 5 the war was waged by Sadiates, son of Alyattes, who, as I have before shown, inherited the war from his father and carried it on vigorously. None of the Ionians helped to lighten this war for the Milesians, except only the Chians. These lent their aid for a like service done to themselves, for the Milesians had formerly helped the Chians in their war against the Erythraeans. Miletus is down in the southern part of the green area inhabited by the Ionians. This whole coastal region of Anatolia was all populated by Greeks. These were all Greek colonies, but they were sort of divided by 3 different dialectic groups. All right, so they all spoke Greek, but 3 different dialects of Greek. The Aeolians at the north, the Ionians in the middle, and the Dorians in the south. In the 12th year, when the Lydian army was burning the crops, it so happened that the fire set to the crops and blown by a strong wind caught the temple of Athena, called Athene of Assesos, and the temple was burnt to the ground. For the nonce no account was taken of this. But presently, after the army had returned to Sardis, Alyattes fell sick, and, his sickness lasting longer than it should, he sent to Delphi to inquire of the oracle, either by someone's counsel or by his own wish to question the god about his sickness. But when the messengers came to Delphi, the Pythian priestess would not reply to them before they should restore the temple of Athene at Assesos in the Milesian territory, which they had burned. Thus far I know the truth, for the Delphians told me. The Milesians add to the story that Periander, son of Caepselus, being a close friend of Thrasybulus, who then was sovereign of Miletus, learned what reply the oracle had given to Alyattes, and sent a dispatch to tell Thrasybulus, so that thereby his friend should be forewarned, and make his plans accordingly. So, while Miletus is at war with the Lydians, the ruler of Miletus finds out about the situation with the oracle. Thrasybulus was the tyrant. That didn't necessarily mean like a terrible ruler. It just meant the supreme ruler. He was the autocratic ruler. He was the sole sovereign, and his word was law. He was the tyrant of Miletus in the 7th century BC, not to be confused with Thrasybulus of Athens, who was a general later on in the Peloponnesian Wars from the 4th century BC. Such is the Milesian story. Then, when the Delphic reply was brought to Alyattes, straightway he sent a herald to Miletus, offering to make a truce with Thrasybulus and the Milesians during his building of the temple. So the envoy went to Miletus. But Thrasybulus, being exactly forewarned of the whole matter, and knowing what Alyattes meant to do, devised the following plan. He brought together into the marketplace all the food in the city, from private stores and his own, and bade all the men of Miletus all drink and revel together when he should give the word. The intent of his so doing and commanding was, that when the herald from Sardis saw a great heap of food piled up, and the citizens making merry, he might bring word of it to Alyattes, and so it befell. The herald saw all this, gave Thrasybulus the message he was charged by the Lydian to deliver, and returned to Sardis. And this, as far as I can learn, was the single reason of the reconciliation. For Alyattes had supposed that there was great scarcity in Miletus, and that the people were reduced to the last extremity of misery. But now on his herald's return from the town he heard an account contrary to his expectations. So presently the Lydians and Milesians ended the war, and agreed to be friends and allies. And Alyattes built not 1, but 2 temples of Athena at Assesos, and recovered of his sickness. Such is the story of Alyattes' war against Thrasybulus and the Milesians. So this stratagem epitomizes a wise strategy, according to Chinese writer Sun Tzu, The Art of War. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. So this was a ruse, and it worked. It tricked the Lydians. They believed that, rightly so, that the Milesians were starving. After all, they'd been taking and destroying their crops for the last 11 years, so they were pretty much down to their last legs. Now they did command the sea, as he said, so I'm sure they were still able to get some supplies by sea routes, but they were surely in very dire straits, probably on the verge of starvation. By this ruse, he presented a facade where it looked like everything was going great. And you can imagine Alyattes he's sick, the gods are mad at him. He and his father have both been waging this war for the last 11 years, and he's waiting for them to break from the starvation, and he finds out they're drinking and partying and having a big old feast in Miletus. And so you can imagine him being like, you know what, that's fine, we're done. Periander, who disclosed the oracle's answer to Thrasybulus, was the son of Caepsellus and sovereign lord of Corinth. As the Corinthians and Lesbians agree in relating, there happened to him a thing which was the most marvelous in his life, namely the landing of Arion of Methymna on Taenarus, borne thither by a dolphin. This Arion was a lyre player second to none in that age. He was the first man, as far as we know, to compose and name the dithyramb, which he afterwards taught at Corinth. Now, the dithyramb was an ancient Greek poetic hymn that was sung and danced, and usually dedicated to the god Dionysius. And this part is fairly characteristic of Herodotus' method. As we go through the book, he's going to go into all these different tangents and side stories that have nothing really to do with the story at hand of the progress of this war between the Greeks and the Lydians in this case. But remember, his intent is to relate great deeds and wonders, and the story he's about to tell is indeed a wonder. Thus, then, the story runs. For the most part he lived at the court of Periander. Then he formed the plan of voyaging to Italy and Sicily, whence, after earning much money, he was minded to return to Corinth. Having a special trust in men of that city, he hired a Corinthian ship to carry him from Terrace. But when they were out at sea, the crew plotted to cast Arion overboard and take his money. During the plot, he earnestly entreated them, offering them all his money if they would but spare his life. But the sailors would not listen to him. He must, they said, either kill himself, and so receive burial on land, or straightway cast himself into the sea. In this extremity Arion besought them, seeing that such was their will, that they would suffer him to stand on the poop deck with all his singing robes about him and sing. And after his song, so he promised, he would make away with himself. The men, well pleased at the thought of hearing the best singer in the world, drew away from the stern amidships. Arion, putting on all his adornment and taking his lyre, stood up on the poop deck and sang the shrill strain, and at its close threw himself without more ado into the sea, clad in his robes. So the crew sailed away to Corinth. But a dolphin, so the story goes, took Arion on his back and bore him to Taenarus. There he landed, went to Corinth in his singing robes, and when he came, told all that had befallen him. Periander, not believing the tale, put him in close ward, and kept careful watch for the coming of the sailors. When they came, they were called and questioned what news they brought of Arion, and they replied that he was safe in the parts of Italy, and that they had left him sound and well at Terrace. When, behold, they were confronted with Arion, just as he was when he leapt from the ship, whereat they were amazed, and could no more deny what was proved against them. Such is the story told by the Corinthians and Lesbians. There is, moreover, a little bronze monument to Arion on Taenarus, a figure of a man riding upon a dolphin. This story is very peculiar because he really gives no indication of what the motivation is for the sailors to insist on Arion's death. They obviously wanted to rob him, but they said, "You must die." That's very strange. It kind of harkens to the myth of Taurus, the Homeric hymn of Dionysus in the Sailors, and even the biblical account of Jonah.
So Alyattes the Lydian, having finished his war with the Milesians, died after a reign of 57 years. He was the second of his family to make an offering to Delphi, and this was a thank offering for his recovery, of a great silver bowl on a stand of welded iron.
This is the most notable among all the offerings at Delphi, and is the work of Glaucus the Chian, the only man of that age who discovered how to weld iron. So that's notable because at the time when this was set, it was still basically in the Bronze Age. After the death of Alyattes, Croesus his son came to the throne, being then 35 years of age. The first Greeks whom he attacked were the Ephesians. These, being besieged by him, dedicated their city to Artemis. This they did by attaching a rope to the city wall from the temple of the goddess, standing 7 furlongs away from the ancient city, which was then being besieged. These were the first whom Croesus attacked. Afterwards he made war on the Ionian and Aeolian cities in turn, each on its separate indictment. He found graver charges where he could, but sometimes alleged very paltry grounds of offense. So Herodotus mentions this dedication of Ephesus to the goddess Artemis, or Diana in Latin. And you might remember that from the book of Acts in the Bible, when Paul is traveling through Ephesus, and there's a riot there because of a certain silversmith and the idols that they had to Artemis. And he also points out that Croesus is attacking the various Greek cities of Ionia and Aeolia, but he's using any justification he can find, and even very paltry grounds of offense. So even really piddling stuff, he's using it as an excuse to attack the Greeks. Then, when he had subdued and made tributary to himself all the Asiatic Greeks of the mainland, he planned to build ships and attack the islanders. But when his preparations for shipbuilding were ready, either Bias of Priene or Pittacus of Mytilene, the story is told of both, came to Sardis, and being asked by Croesus for news about Hellas, put an end to the shipbuilding by giving the following answer. King, the islanders are buying 10,000 horse, with intent to march against you to Sardis. Croesus, thinking that he spoke the truth, said, Would that the gods may put in the mind of the island men to come on horseback against the sons of the Lydians. Then the other answered and said, King, I see that you earnestly pray that you may catch the islanders riding horses on the mainland, and what you expect is but natural. And the islanders, now that they have heard that you are building ships to attack them therewith, think you that they pray for aught else than that they might catch Lydians on the seas, and thereby be avenged on you for having enslaved the Greeks who dwell in the mainland? Croesus was well pleased with this conclusion, for it seemed to him that the men spoke reasonably. So he took the advice and built no more ships. Thus it came about that he made friends of the Ionian islanders. So once again, wisdom saves the day in this case. Croesus is getting greedy. He's conquered all the Greeks who live on the coast, and now he wants to move into the Aegean and start taking out those islands right off the coast of Anatolia. Once his preparations become known, one of the Greeks comes to Sardis and tells Croesus that the islanders, these would be all those guys off the coast, are buying all these horses, and they're going to march a giant army of cavalry to Sardis to attack him. And Croesus is thrilled by that because they're islanders. What do they know about cavalry warfare? He is the king of Lydia, which is, they live up on basically a high plateau in Anatolia, and they are horse warriors. That's what they do. So he's like, yeah, come against me with the horses. I will defeat them easily. And then the Greek points out to him, well, king, you are the one building ships to sail against the islanders who live on islands. They sail the seas. That's what they do. And you, the horse warrior, are going to attack them with ships. And Croesus is well pleased with that conclusion. He sees the wisdom of it in such a way that he actually really appreciates it and decides not only to call the whole thing off, but even to make friends of the Ionian islanders. As time went on, Croesus subdued well nigh all the nations west of the Halys, and held them in subjection, except only the Cilicians and Lycians. The rest, Lydians, Phrygians, Mysians, Mariandynians, Calybes, Paphlagonians, Thymians, and Bithynians, who are Thracians, Carians, Ionians, Dorians, Aeolians, Pamphylians, were subdued and became subjects of Croesus, like the Lydians, and Sardis was at the height of its wealth. Croesus was known for his wealth, and the source of his wealth was conquering all of these different tribes and city-states and making them tributaries. So they all had to pay tribute to him at Sardis. There came to the city all the teachers from Hellas who then lived, in this or that manner, and among them came Solon of Athens. He, having made laws for the Athenians at their request, left his home for 10 years, and set out on a voyage to see the world, as he said. This he did, lest he should be compelled to repeal any of the laws he had made, since the Athenians themselves could not repeal them, for they were bound by solemn oaths to abide for 10 years by such laws as Solon had made. So Solon is one of the most famous Athenians. He was a lawgiver, a scholar. He lived from around 630 to 560 BC. He was very esteemed for his wisdom and is remembered as one of the sages of Greece. And he was an ancestor of the philosopher Plato. And this situation that he's referring to is after Solon crafted the laws for Athens, he was worried that as politics went on, he would be pressured to change the laws or repeal them. So he had the Athenians bind themselves to an oath for 10 years that they would live by the laws he made, to give them time to work out and see how they actually function in a long-term way. And to hold them to that oath so they wouldn't pressure him to try and change the laws, he then left on a 10-year journey. For this reason, and to see the world, Solon left Athens and visited Amasis in Egypt and Croesus at Sardis. And when he had come, Croesus entertained him in his palace. Now on the 3rd or 4th day after his coming, Croesus bade his servants lead Solon round among his treasures, and they showed him all that was there, the greatness and the prosperous state of it. And when he had seen and considered all, Croesus, when occasion served, thus questioned him. Our Athenian guest, we have heard much of you by reason of your wisdom and your wanderings, how that you have traveled far to seek knowledge and to see the world. Now, therefore, I am fain to ask you, if you have ever seen a man more blessed than all his fellows. So Croesus inquired, supposing himself to be blessed beyond all men. But Solon spoke the truth without flattery. Such a one, O king, he said, I have seen, Tellus of Athens. Croesus wondered at this, and sharply asked Solon, How do you judge Tellus to be most blessed? Solon replied, Tellus' city was prosperous, and he was the father of noble sons, and he saw children born to all of them, and their state well established. Moreover, having then as much wealth as a man may among us, he crowned his life with a most glorious death. For in a battle between the Athenians and their neighbors at Eleusis, he attacked and routed the enemy, and most nobly died there. And the Athenians gave him public burial, where he fell, and paid him great honor. Now when Solon had roused the curiosity of Croesus by recounting the many ways in which Tellus was blessed, the king further asked him who he placed second after Tellus, thinking that assuredly the second prize at least would be his. Solon answered, Cleobus and Biton. These were Argives, and besides sufficient wealth, they had such strength of body as I will show. Both were prize winners, and this story too is related of them. There was a festival of Hera toward among the Argives, and their mother must by all means be drawn to the temple by a yoke of oxen. But the oxen did not come in time from the fields, so the young men, being thus thwarted by lack of time, put themselves to the yoke and drew the carriage with their mother sitting thereon. For 45 furlongs they drew it till they came to the temple. Having done this, and been seen by the assembly, they made a most excellent end of their lives, and the god showed by these men how that it was better for a man to die than to live. For the men of Argos came round and gave the youths joy of their strength, and so likewise did the women to their mother for the excellence of her sons. She then, in her joy at what was done and said, came before the image of the goddess, and prayed that her sons Cleobus and Biton, who had done such great honor to the goddess, should be given the best boon that a man may receive. After the prayer the young men sacrificed and ate of the feast. Then they lay down to sleep in the temple itself, and never rose up more, but here ended their lives. Then the Argives made and set up at Delphi images of them because of their excellence. So this festival in Argos to the goddess Hera surely had something to do with mothers being taken to the temple. Hera was the queen of the gods. She was the wife and sister of Zeus, the lord of the gods, and she was the goddess of women, marriage, family, and childbirth, and she's equivalent to Juno in the Roman pantheon. So Solon gave to Cleobus and Biton the second prize of happiness. But Croesus said in anger, Guest from Athens, is our prosperity then held by you so worthless, that you match us not even with common men? Croesus, said Solon, you ask me concerning the lot of men. Well, I know how jealous is heaven, and how it loves to trouble us. In a man's length of days he may see and suffer many things that he much mislikes. For I set the limit of man's life at 70 years. In these 70 are days 25,200, if we count not the intercalary month. But if every second year be lengthened by a month, so that the seasons in the calendar may rightly accord, then the intercalary months are 35, over and above the 70 years, and the days of these months are 1,050. So then all the days together of the 70 years are seen to be 26,250, and one may well say that no one of all these days is like another in that which it brings. Thus, then, Croesus, the whole of man is but chance. Now if I am to speak to you, I say that I see you very rich, and the king of many men. But I cannot yet answer your question, before I hear that you have ended your life well. For he who is very rich is not more blessed than he who has but enough for the day, unless fortune so attend him that he ends his life well, having all good things about him. Many men of great wealth are unblessed, and many that have no great substance are fortunate. Now the very rich man who is yet unblessed has but 2 advantages over the fortunate man. But the fortunate man has many advantages over the rich but unblessed. For this latter is the stronger to accomplish his desire, and to bear the stroke of great calamity. But these are the advantages of the fortunate man, that though he be not so strong as the other to deal with calamity and desire, yet these are kept far from him by his good fortune, and he is free from deformity, sickness, and all evil, and happy in his children and his comeliness. If then such a man, besides all this, shall also end his life well, then he is the man whom you seek, and is worthy to be called blessed. But we must wait till he be dead, and call him not yet blessed, but fortunate. Now no one, who is but man, can have all these good things together, just as no land is altogether self-sufficing in what it produces. One thing it has, another it lacks, and the best land is that which has most. So too no single person is sufficient for himself. One thing he has, another he lacks. But whoever continues in the possession of most things, and at last makes a gracious end of his life, such a man, O king, I deem worthy of this title. We must look to the conclusion of every matter, and see how it shall end, for there are many to whom heaven has given a vision of blessedness, and yet afterwards brought them to utter ruin. So we see in this discourse by Solon a little bit of a precursor of the great philosophical question that occupied so many Greek thinkers, which is, what is the best thing in life? What is the ultimate good in life? And different schools of philosophy came up with many different answers and formulations for this. Here Solon is presenting his particular perspective of all the things which go together to make the best life. So spoke Solon. Croesus therefore gave him no largesse, but sent him away as a man of no account, for he thought that man to be very foolish, who disregarded present prosperity, and bade him look rather to the end of every matter. But after Solon's departure, the divine anger fell heavily on Croesus, as, I guess, because he supposed himself to be blessed beyond all other men. Presently, as he slept, he was visited by a dream, which foretold truly to him the evil which should befall his son. He had 2 sons, one of whom was wholly undone, for he was deaf and dumb. But the other, whose name was Atys, was in every way far preeminent over all of his years. The dream then showed to Croesus that Atys should be smitten and killed by a spear of iron. So Croesus, when he woke and considered the dream with himself, was greatly affrighted by it. And first he made a marriage for his son, and moreover, whereas Atys was wont to lead the Lydian armies, Croesus now would not suffer him to go out on any such enterprise, while he took the javelins and spears and all such instruments of war from the men's apartments, and piled them up in his storehouse, lest any of them should fall upon his son from where it hung. So Herodotus offers us a little commentary on the divine anger and the latter part of Croesus's life, and he makes an important connection, as he's wont to do, with his sort of moral presentation of these stories. He makes a connection to the idea of hubris, which was a very important idea to the ancient Greeks. Hubris basically means excessive or dangerous pride and self-confidence, especially the type of arrogance that is defiant towards the gods. and the divine ordinances. When a man thinks so highly of himself that he's not humble before the gods, and he does not consider that all his good fortune depends on them. This appears thematically in Greek literature as a cause of divine punishment. They view it as almost like a particular form of karma. If a man is arrogant and prideful towards the gods and so self-sufficient in his own estimation, the gods will make a point to bring that man low and often bring him to a terrible end. Now while Croesus was busied about the marriage of his son, there came to Sardis a Phrygian of the royal house, in great distress and with hands unclean. This man came to Croesus' house, and entreated that he might be purified, after the custom of the country. So Croesus purified him. The Lydians used the same manner of purification as do the Greeks. And when he had done all according to usage, he inquired of the Phrygian whence he came, and who he was. "Friend," said he, "who are you, and from what place in Phrygia do you come to be my suppliant? And what man or woman have you slain?" "O king," the man answered, "I am the son of Gordius, the son of Midas, and my name is Adrastus. By no will of mine I slew my brother, and hither I am come, banished by my father, and bereft of all." Croesus answered, "All of your family are my friends, and to friends you have come, among whom you shall lack nothing, but abide in my house. And for your misfortune bear it as lightly as may be, and you will be the more profited." So this Adrastus, a prince of the royal line, is a Phrygian. The Phrygians are a tribe from central Anatolia, and they were renowned for their distinctive caps of soft cone-shaped felt, which was usually red. And this cap was later adopted by the Romans as the badge of a freed slave, and it was called a liberty cap, whence it was adopted in later times by adepts of alchemy and the revolutionaries of the French Revolution. And some notable Phrygians include the legendary King Midas, who, according to legend, was able to turn everything to gold which he touched, as well as Aesop, the compiler of the Book of Fables. So Adrastus lived in Croesus' house. About this time there appeared on the Mysian Olympus a great monster of a boar, who would issue out from that mountain and ravage the fields of the Mysians. Often had the Mysians gone out against him, but they never did him any harm, and rather were themselves hurt thereby. At last they sent messengers to Croesus with this message: "King, a great monster of a boar has appeared in the land, who destroys our fields. For all our attempts we cannot kill him. Now, therefore, we beseech you, send with us your son, and chosen young men and dogs, that we may rid the country of him." Such was their entreaty, but Croesus remembered the prophecy of his dream, and thus answered them: "Say no more about my son. I will not send him with you. He is newly married, and that is his present business. But I will send chosen men of the Lydians, and all the hunt, and I will bid those who go to use all zeal in aiding you to rid the country of this beast." So he replied, and the Mysians were satisfied with this. But the son of Croesus now came in, who had heard the request of the Mysians, and when Croesus refused to send his son with them, "Father," said the young man, "it was formerly held fairest and noblest that we princes should go constantly to war and the chase, and win thereby renown. But now you have barred me from both of these, not for any sign that you have seen in me of a coward or craven spirit. With what face can I thus show myself whenever I go to and from the marketplace? What will the men of the city think of me, and what my new wedded wife? With what manner of man will she think that she dwells? Nay, do you either let me go to this hunt, or show me by reason good that what you are doing is best for me." "My son," answered Croesus, "if I do this, it is not that I have seen cowardice or aught unseemly in you. No, but the vision of a dream stood over me in my sleep, and told me that your life should be short, for you should be slain by a spear of iron. It is for that vision that I was careful to make your marriage, and send you on no enterprise that I have in hand, but keep guard over you, so that haply I may trick death of you through my lifetime. You are my only son, for that other, since his hearing is lost to him, I count no son of mine." "Father," the youth replied, "none can blame you for keeping guard over me when you have seen such a vision. It is my right to show you this which you do not perceive, and wherein you mistake the meaning of the dream. You say that the dream told you that I should be killed by a spear of iron, but has a boar hands? Has it that iron spear which you dread? Had the dream said I should be slain by a tusk, or some other thing belonging to a boar, you had been right in acting as you act. But no, it was to be a spear. Therefore, since it is not against men that we are to fight, suffer me to go." Croesus answered, "My son, your judgment concerning the dream does somewhat overpersuade me, and being so convinced by you, I change my purpose, and permit you to go to the chase." Having said this, Croesus sent for Adrastus the Phrygian, and when he came thus addressed him: "Adrastus, when you were smitten by grievous misfortune, for which I blame you not, it was I who cleansed you, and received and still keep you in my house, defraying all your charges. Now, therefore, as you owe me a return of good service for the benefits which I have done you, I ask you to watch over my son as he goes out to the chase. See to it that no ruffian robbers meet you on the way or do you harm. Moreover, it is but right that you, too, should go where you can win renown by your deeds. That is fitting for your father's son, and you are strong enough withal." "O king," Adrastus answered, "had it been otherwise, I would not have gone forth on this enterprise. One so unfortunate as I should not consort with the prosperous among his peers, nor have I the wish to do so, and for many reasons I would have held back. But now, since you so desire, and I must do your pleasure, owing you as I do a requital of good service, I am ready to obey you in this, and for your son, insofar as I can protect him, look for his coming back unharmed." So when Adrastus had thus answered Croesus, they went out presently equipped with a company of chosen young men and dogs. When they had come to Mount Olympus, they hunted for the beast, and having found him, they made a ring, and threw their spears at him. Then the guests called Adrastus, the man who had been cleansed of the deed of blood, missed the boar with his spear, and hit the son of Croesus. So Atys was smitten by the spear, and fulfilled the utterance of the dream. One ran to bring Croesus word of what had been done, and came to Sardis, where he told the king of the fight and the manner of his son's end. So when they're going to hunt the boar at Mount Olympus, it's referring to the Mycenaean Mount Olympus, which is not to be confused with the Mount Olympus in Greece, where the Olympian gods were said to dwell. Croesus, distraught by the death of his son, cried out the more vehemently, because the slayer was one whom he himself had cleansed of a bloody deed, and in his great and terrible grief at this mischance, he called on Zeus by 3 names: Zeus the purifier, Zeus of the hearth, Zeus of comrades. The first, because he would have the god know what evil his guest had wrought him. The second, because he had received the guest into his house, and thus unwittingly entertained the slayer of his son. And the third, because he had found his worst foe in the man whom he sent as a protector.